Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to call to order the third meeting of the Pension Task Force. Today is August 5th, 2021. Aaron and Molly, could you assist with going around the horns for introductions?
Sure. I'll start. I'm Aaron Chapinsky from the mayor's office, and I hope through my mask I'm reaching the microphone. And I'll throw it over to my right.
One addendum real quick. I would ask that everybody in the room, if you can pull down your mask a little as you speak. I don't know if that's acceptable. It'll be a lot clearer for us to hear you.
Really, when I said these, so, yeah.
Gina Spang, BJF Construction, but a public member of the committee. Hi, Joanne.
Thank you.
Mike Bongiorno, President of the Firefighters, Local 215.
Cleary, City of Milwaukee, Deferred Compensation Executive Director.
And Molly King, Budget Office, facilitating with Aaron Chapinsky.
Aisha Zala, City Comptroller.
Jerry Allen, I'm with the Employees Retirement System. I guess we're the subject of this examination.
And I'll go down the line and call people out who are on the phone or on the video. Dennis Yacarino.
Yep, I'm here. Hi, how are you doing?
Hey, Dennis. We have Mark Belzik. Are you on?
Yeah, Mark Pelzik with AFSCME, Vice President of Council 32.
Mary Reevy. Hi, Mary.
Hi, I'm here. Thank you.
Rhonda Ronsman.
Please.
And our newest member, Ron Roberts, is on with us too, correct?
Hello.
Hi, Ron. Do we have you on?
I'm Mark Nicolini calling in.
Hi, Mark. We got you. We hear you loud and clear, Mark.
I'm sorry.
And then I think Alderman Kovac just joined as well too. Well, good. Well, I guess we can start diving into some of the conversation. Aaron, I know, Aaron, you're going to do some level setting for us today and kind of do a little short recap of the last two meetings.
Sure, and thanks. And I just want to recognize for the whole task force, Jomar, Mr. Riley had to step down as chair, and the mayor is glad for his commitment and is also really grateful to Jomar for stepping up to chair the task force. I think Jomar asked for some level setting, and I think one thing that was really clear from the first two meetings, for those of you who were able to make it, and they're available, I'm glad to share those with anybody who hasn't gotten yet, is the city's.
Was that a plan, or I thought you were going to go earlier, but no.
Hey, if you're not speaking, could everybody please mute? Go ahead, Aaron.
In terms of the first couple of meetings, I think the first one we really talked about how we got here, the city's pension fund, key things that have happened since 1999, particularly global pension settlement, which locked in a pretty large amount of city employees and their pension benefits going forward. The history of how the city's funded the pension fund, and our role as plan sponsor, which from the mayor's perspective, I think is the most crucial thing that the task force should be looking at, because I think Jerry, as the director of the pension fund, and his board of trustees, obviously, they make the decisions, and they have the fiduciary duty, to run the plan and ensure that the benefits are available for members. Our concern continues to be the city's stability and consistency in funding all of those benefits. And so we talked a little bit at the second meeting, both the Pew Charitable Trust and Rob Henkin of the Policy Forum, about the outlook for pension funding, how the counties approached it, how the states approached it, and some of the levers that are available to the city as a funder to be able to manage funding for pensions, but also be able to continue to field all the critical services that our residents and taxpayers and businesses rely on. So fire service, EMS, police, obviously, but also libraries and public health and all the things that the city of Milwaukee does and needs to do for our residents. So I think for everybody going forward, we really want to focus on, and I think the mayor would encourage everybody to focus on how we balance that funding commitment. I think we recognize the pension fund itself may have future challenges, but right now is performing well. And I think you all got from me earlier this great slide from Jerry Allen at ERS showing exactly, kind of the net positive cash flow, I would say. Maybe that's not the right term, and I'll look at the comptroller. But the fund itself is taking in more than it's putting out on average over the last 8 to 10 years. And I think we should all be proud of that. The city's played a good role in funding it, but we really need to look at the sustainability. And the things that we heard from Q and from the policy forum really consistently were, the actuarial assumptions are going to be what they are. They're not something we can control necessarily, but our revenue structure was something that's been brought up over and over again, not only by Q and the policy forum, but also by the bond rating agencies, pretty consistently over the last 3 or 4 years. And, we are relying on the property tax. So revenue is a big thing for us. And I think what the mayor is looking for the task force to do, to look at revenue, but also let's look at other ways that we might be able to innovate or make some commitments, suggestions, recommendations that the mayor can then pick up and move forward with. So I think anything else that I'm missing, I'd love to have task force members chime in, but Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Good, thank you, Aaron. I think that's a good summation of kind of where we are right now. And just for, kind of continue the level setting, I think the goal would be to have the work of this task force wrap up this month. I think today's conversation should be about discussion, right? For us to really have an opportunity to take in the first 2 meetings, some of the pieces that we had to the puzzle, and really start talking about some of those items in more depth, and seeing if we can start the process as we move into our next meeting of start to coalescing around certain issues that we feel are important or that we want to kind of advance forward with as a group. Obviously, there's a lot of concern from the community about this work and about service cuts. There's certain things we can do, certain things we can't do as a city, and I think we have an opportunity today to really just kind of go around the horn a little bit and be able to talk about how the task force members are really feeling about some of those issues that have came up and some of the potential solutions, and just try to get them on the table and see where we go when it comes to coalescing around them. So with that, I think it might be good to just kind of start the conversation by going around the horn to the members and really kind of seeing if anything resonated over these past 2 meetings that bubbled up to the surface. There was many different solutions presented, from revenue increases, spending cuts to services, pension bonds, moving to the state retirement system, a multitude of things. So I want to open it up, see if there's any volunteers who would like to start that conversation, but then I think we can also go around the horn as well too if we don't have any willing volunteers who want to start first.
Mary Reevy, I guess I'll start first, as long as nobody else wants to. One thing I'd like to say is most of the stuff that was put forth in the last couple of meetings are things I've been hearing about a long time. As you may know, I was the assessment commissioner for the city, so I'm well aware of what the budget issues are that we are facing. And it's been, this is a dire thing, but it's been kind of a tough situation all along, trying to make ends meet and keep the services we need, and yet make the property tax payments, as affordable as possible. So, cutting services to the tune that we would have to does not seem like a viable solution to me. I do like the idea of trying to go to the state once again to try and get more revenue for the city in another format, whether it's income tax, sales tax, or whatever. Because as I used to study the information for other large cities that are comparable to us, I'm well aware that we are the only municipality of this size that only relies on the property tax in, our service fees for, its budget. So that's a huge issue. Other cities have the ability to raise revenue, and we're really stuck because of the way that the statutes are written. And, trying to get something passed obviously is not easy, but I guess I'll just stop there.
There was an interesting article I just read this afternoon, or an opinion piece on Urban Milwaukee about the missed opportunity during the Bucks run for sales tax, about what that could have accounted for with all that influx of spending in downtown Milwaukee had we had a dedicated income source from the sales tax. So that's a very interesting point of view.
No one else is.
Yep, go ahead, Mark.
Can you hear me okay? Maybe
Yep,
you don't want to hear me, but okay. Couple things I would say right off the bat. One would be, this is following from the discussion we had with Pew last week or last meeting. I really would like to see some specific stress tests performed, which would look at alternative levels of contributions based on different, on one hand, different assumed rates of return, assumed actual rates of return based on, and use the 7.5% discount rate maybe as the starting point, but then also look at a couple lower and perhaps a couple higher rates of return. And then, but then in terms of the contribution, look at some absolute dollar amounts, different levels. I'm stuck out here on the northwest side without any materials, so, but I'm thinking, you might do a $12 million annual increase until you reach a certain level, and then CPI thereafter. Then maybe do a higher amount, maybe 18 or 24 million, which would still be quite a bit lower than what Langer's projections call for. But then see what that does to really, I think, three dimensions. One, obviously the funded ratio, go ahead and use the 7.5% discount rate to bring back the liabilities, but then also look at solvency, defined as the number of years of benefits that you can pay from what you got each year, and also that operating ratio that we talked about. See what it does to that, and whether we can actually fund the benefits from cash flow each year, that being employer and employee contributions as well as the investment return. And then the second thing, at least in terms of revenues for the time being, I think it's fine to go to the state and ask, but I see that as having very little potential. But we do have some assets. I'll just name four of them. Drinking water, local sewer, the port, and the parking asset, all of which have been modeled at one time or another in terms of their potential value. Obviously, those are really big issues, but we're not going to get even to those contribution levels I mentioned by, tinkering around with the fees that we have. So I think that those are worth looking at. Finally, I don't know exactly what the constraints are, but given that we're so disproportionate in terms of contribution rates, what the generals pay in terms of a percentage of their normal costs versus the protectives, I think we should look at that as well. Perhaps a higher proportion, probably subject to collective bargaining, but unless the state steps in its wisdom and declares it a matter of statewide concern. So those are some of my thoughts that I had. I don't think I think trying to either fund Mr. Langer's projection or tinker around the edges, I don't think either one of those approaches are going to be viable to accomplish what we've been talking about. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. One piece, as I was absent at the last meeting, and I would, if anybody could chime in. I know the pension obligation bond piece kind of resonated with me just outside of the last meeting. So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts or potential concerns or comments about that particular option.
Well, I'm the comptroller, so I can speak to that. Well, we did actually do a presentation about the bonds to the finance committee and council. And, you know, after this meeting, I can send the presentation that we actually had there because we outlined kind of all the pros and cons and the risks that go along with it. The problem with the bonds Milwaukee County did the bonds, and I think the problem with the bonds is there's a good and a bad, right? You don't know exactly how well you're doing because you can't rate it on any specific year. You kind of have to look at it over the long haul. The problem is that you're kind of almost hedging in a way because the rate that you earn in the pension fund has to be higher than the interest rates that you're paying back on the bonds. So you're taking a risk with the market, really. There can be an upside, there can be a downside, but I think that I think that it's a pretty big, because you're kind of taking a huge amount of money and dumping it into the pension fund right away. So, and then you're kind of going through and then slowly paying it back. So there is,
when we talk pension obligation, but like how much money we talking, like how many?
it depends on how much you want to take it for. Now, the other issue is if you take it for a lot of money, usually you would need some kind of moral backing or like an obligation, which generally kind of takes us back to the state.
Right.
So that's the other challenge.
I don't think boss would be signing on for that, right?
Right. So I think so there are a lot of different complications that go into it. I wish I had my slides in front of me because Joshua, who's my deputy, actually did the slides really well and kind of listed out.
So is there a step below like a huge pension obligation bond, like more of a smaller thing to get us through a 5-year period?
Yeah, you could take less.
Right? So is that an option instead of taking like a big risk? Like instead of me going to Potawatomi with $2,000, I'm just gonna go to Potawatomi with $100.
Yeah, I mean, all different. There's so many different options, I guess, that could be available that way. I will also add, you know, the city's rating is actually pretty low right now.
Okay.
And we're on a negative outlook. So there's a chance we could get downgraded. So that wouldn't help us if we borrowed more as well, because that means we would be paying higher interest costs because we would get a higher interest rate. So that challenges us that kind of piggybacks onto the challenge as well. But I was actually going to speak up, kind of not really changing the topic, but a little bit. I wanted to echo off of Mark's comments. I do kind of like his idea of exploring the different revenue options and like the parking options. I think there's some things that we can explore in that realm. But I will definitely send those slides around because the slides explain it really well. But I guess I can take any questions.
Can I get educated on something?
Sure.
Tips. Everybody talks about tips, and I know what they are, but like, how does the city of Milwaukee sit with the amount of tips we have and how that affects our city? Is that a loaded question? I'm sorry.
It is kind of a loaded question. So I was thinking about where you could start that would make that more easily.
Because I'm a little naive. I mean, I know a little bit about what a TIF is, but like, I hear people complain about them, and I'm sitting at this meeting and I thought, what the heck, why not just ask? Because I don't even know how to get in a debate with someone about that.
Yeah. I'm not sure that the tips are really super relevant to this topic.
No, okay.
Because I don't
They're,
think that that
they're
would.
not like that big of a mover in property tax, whether, like how they affect what we're getting in.
Yeah, I mean, it does help. I don't know if, is there someone that can explain it better than I can?
Well, yeah,
I could try to, can you hear me, Joe Mar? It's Alderman Kovac.
Yeah, we got you.
I wanted to weigh in on the POBs anyway, but with the TIF question, the TIFs do not affect the tax, the amount of taxes collected. They actually affect the rate. They put certain property tax collections off into a separate pile, but it doesn't really raise or lower the amount collected. It raises or lowers the total amount of property that you divide by, so it affects the rate. I know that's a little confusing what I just said, but the short answer is
Right.
the TIFs are very constrained by state law. They have to pass a but-for test, and they can only be used for particular properties or sometimes for a half mile around the properties for infrastructure investments. They can't be used for general city operating, or if they can, I don't think they can be, or for a pension fund. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be able to do it that way. I don't think TIFs would apply here to help us, but they also don't hurt us, other than to the extent that we do borrow money up front for some TIFs, it potentially limits the amount of other borrowing the city could do. I don't know. I hope I summarized that.
No, that's good. Thank you, Alderman.
More or less accurately. And in terms of the POBs, I mean, Aicha's right that, I mean, or there's a scale. I mean, borrowing less is better than borrowing more because you're paying interest. But given this, I guess I would say, given the scale of this potential gap, there's no scenario, and based on the presentations I've seen as a pension board member and the presentation that Aicha mentioned that was done to the finance committee, I don't think that the pension obligation bonds are a good way out. They're really just a way of kicking the can down the road, and they may make the problem worse. You're buying time, but you're guaranteeing a time bomb at the end of the time that you bought, and you're also effectively sacrificing your sovereignty to a bank or to whoever, or to some global conglomeration of capital now owns you. As of right now, we have a moral and legal obligation to everyone within the pension system, and that to me is a pretty firm obligation. But actually having a third party own the money is a totally different game. Now you're starting to be like Detroit or Puerto Rico. Is my fear, and I'm willing to explore it, and this task force wants to explore everything. But based on the initial reports I've seen, you're really hedging against future interest rates to maybe you get lucky and you come out a little bit ahead, but the risk is huge. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. Essentially what you're doing is borrowing a ton of money and hoping things are better in 20 or 30 years. But it's not fundamentally different from the situation we're in now. But when you borrow the money, you actually accelerate your risk, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Alderman Kovac. That's helpful commentary. Any additional thoughts around that issue or any other issues that are rising up to the top of concern? I know that we had some discussion around potentially new employees going to the state retirement system. Maybe we can throw that item on the table as well too for discussion.
I thought the only risk with that one was that, from what Jerry has told me in the past, is that we have to make the payments to the state first, right, before our own fund.
Right.
And Jerry can probably say that better than me.
Well, first of all, there aren't any future employees yet. So there's no cost for future employees at the present moment. The $1.3 billion of unfunded liability is for all of us here in this room who are employees and those who have already retired or are deferred retired. So it doesn't really move the needle by sending new people to the state for maybe, if you estimate for the actuaries, maybe over 10 years, you might get half of the workforce into the state plan. Okay, so that's number one, it doesn't really do anything right away. And the city's facing, you know, within a couple of years of a dire situation. The second thing is, when you leave the restaurant, you have to pay the bill. And it works the same way in a pension plan. If we close this pension plan to all the new hires, the actuary has told us that we have to use a different method for funding and valuing the plan. It's called the Aggregate Method, and it accelerates the funding. Generally, I know he's met with Aaron and some of the others, but what he told me is that the preferred approach would be funded over 10 years rather than the 25 or so years we currently have. And then probably have to lower the discount rate, you know, maybe to 7%, maybe even to 6.5%, because now you're funding it over a shorter period of time. And interest rates and the expected return over a 10-year period are much less than they are currently over a 30-year period. So the liability is going to get bigger, and you're going to have less time to pay it off. And from what the numbers that, and I put this in a memo from the actuary into the Taskforce file, you can drop out, you can see it. Sounds like it's going to be $300 million a year in required funding for maybe the first several years, maybe up to 10 years, which just makes the problem worse without really getting anything in the short term. Maybe if you like the state fund, which is a great fund, it's a world-class fund. Maybe it helps long run, but it certainly doesn't get the city out of hot water. Sort of jumping from the frying pan into the fire in the short run, quite frankly.
In my view, I don't think there's really much rationale to look at that one, but.
Well, it also has the unfortunate fact, as one of my former trustees and one of Mike's colleagues, John Barmore, said, create sort of an orphan plan for the current people in the plan in the city of Milwaukee. Because as you said, Aisha, over time, the first contributions will go to the state, mandated by law. If, for whatever reason, the employer can't make those contributions, then the state takes it out of the revenue share. That's in current state law. But that's not much of a problem initially because there is nobody. Given the magnitude of the problem, there probably aren't going to be that many new hires, according to what I hear from Dennis. So it doesn't really do much initially. I did have a couple of other comments I wanted to make, as long as you've asked me to answer a question, Aisha. I look back at the last several years worth of the mayor's budget messages, and each time there was one constant in there, which is that the two top priorities for the budget are, as you would expect, to satisfy the city's legal and financial obligations. Number one, you got to pay the bondholders. Okay, nothing good happens if you don't pay the bondholders. And number two, you have to contribute to the pension plan. So those are the top priorities, and then of course everything else by definition becomes secondary. Okay, and we've already heard from several people how unattractive it's going to be to try to come up with another 71 million or so in additional contributions by beginning in 2023. So to me, I mean, when you look at the CAFR, you see the big item that jumps out is wages. The city is in the business of delivering services, and wages are the top item of the bill. Nobody wants to eliminate positions or constrain services. So the fellow from the pew made a suggestion that he called modeling the consequences of inaction. And I think, and he didn't really define exactly what that meant. I asked the actuary because he said maybe the actuary could engage with the city to do that, right? And I think the purpose of that is to make everyone in this room aware, because I doubt there's any consensus amongst the members of this task force as to what to do, but to make everybody in this room aware of how bad it'll be if we do nothing. Because the choices that everybody faces aren't going to be not pleasant. Alderman Murphy has been saying for several years that choices will be painful. And he's right. So I think the first step is to let everybody know what's your alternative. If you don't make a painful choice, what's going to happen? And that's what the stress test, as Mark mentioned, is really designed to do. So I would, Aaron, I would put that on the top of your list. And that doesn't mean you have to delay anything for very long. You can probably get the actuary in the second half of the year has time. The first half of the year is when he has to, meet all of his client requirements for producing valuations. Other than that, I did want to mention one other thing that's probably in the same category as POBs. It's another Hail Mary, low potential for succeeding, but just so people are aware of every option. In the private sector, where I spent a lot of years, over 30 years, there's a thing we did routinely in finance called a sale leaseback. And now it's starting to happen with public pension plans, particularly in the state of California. They sell their assets, the corporation that they sell, not a Wall Street fund, but a corporation that's a shell that's set up by the municipality, owned by the municipality. They sell the streets, the sewer, the water, the parking into the corporation, and then they go and take out a big fat loan on this. And it only works if you couple it with, if you get the legislature to agree to some additional tax revenue, sales tax, because that's what you use to pay back the debt. Okay, you package these assets in a pool and you go out and you sell bonds against them, and then you take additional tax revenue to pay off the bonds. It buys you time. It has all the same risks that Kovac mentioned before, which is you're mortgaging your future to some Wall Street people who are not necessarily known for kindness if anything goes wrong. But it is nonetheless another option that people should be aware of. Other than that, all the choices are not only painful, but the city really doesn't have unilateral authority to do them. Anything having to do with paying benefits has probably got to be negotiated, collectively bargained with the collective bargaining units. And some of the items would require state legislation. So the city doesn't have a lot of options, a lot of levers that can pull on its own, according to the ones that I considered. So really, that's all I have to say, unless somebody has questions about the pension system. Thank you for listening.
Jomar?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Jerry that we should evaluate the pension obligation bond and compare it to the do nothing option. I don't like either option, but we should definitely, we should be clear-eyed and compare them to each other.
And Jerry brought up another piece at the end as well too, around collective bargaining and looking at items for our current employees. It may be good to talk about that and see the temperature of the task force about making any recommendations around if there should be any additional work around concessions for current employees or future retirees as well too. I figured no reason not to throw that on the table as well too. Is there any for the folks who are representing current employee groups? I know we have some public safety folks up here as well too. That might be any thoughts around that or any of the other pieces?
I have a thought. There is a reason that you can't discuss it. You can't discuss it because that has to be in bargaining. We cannot talk about any recommendations that Nicole should be talking to MPA and Local 215 about in this group. That happens between Nicole and us. We can't do that here. If we do that here, I fold up and I leave. That's what I have to do.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I do want to add though, Jomar, if I can, kind of separate from public safety, I think that there is an HR component with employee retention and compensation packages that could probably be examined somehow in terms of how can the benefit packages maybe be redesigned for the future, because I'm sure everybody in this room knows that we kind of have a little bit of a pay problem with our city employees. If we lose city employees, we lose good employees to other municipalities, and also just go back to the private sector or whatever the case may be. So I do think that that kind of total compensation package is something that should not, just fall by the wayside as well. people like their pay. People like their immediate pay generally, especially the younger folks.
One thing I forgot to mention, I think it's really important about the consequences of inaction study that a few people asked about. The reason, the real underlying reason for this is to make sure all the stakeholders know what the stakes are, and particularly perhaps the legislature. From what I've heard, there seems to be some doubt that the reports that the pension system gets from the actuary are real, you know, which is surprising to me because quite frankly, you know, there's been a lot of discussion for many years of pension assumed rates of return being too high. And then when they come down, people say they don't believe the numbers because they're too pessimistic. That's why you do a study like this to help convince people in the legislative environment that, hey, we're not, the city isn't just making this up. This isn't some ploy to get pet or pet projects. There really is a problem here. So I think that's one of the reasons that people suggested try to get some independent third-party credibility behind the issue of there's a problem.
And Jamar, I wanted to say something too when we were talking about the levers, the various options that were proposed in Pew's presentation and the Wisconsin Policy Forum. One thing for the record, I just wanted to clarify, and I don't know if Patrick is on the call.
Well, he's out of airport.
Oh, so yeah, he can't talk about this. The COLAs, that's not an option legally. So I just want to on the table put that out there and kind of put it to rest. I agree about the stress testing, what's been said about that, and also looking at new modeling. And when we did the pension task force back in 2010, we had the tier 2 come out of it. I think that's something that needs to be factored in when we look at all the different components. The other piece, and I know this from just my previous work, both at the city attorney's office and then working with the ERS, one thing that always stood out about this Milwaukee in comparison to other plans around the country is our funding policy. The fact that we have 100% funding is a unicorn. So I know that that's a political time bomb or a political, you know, grenade. I understand that, but I'm putting that out there that is a unique thing, and it is what is keeping us, you know, with these liabilities up to our eyeballs.
It's also legal.
It's a legal issue too, but I'm just pointing that out. That's the unique thing about the city.
Can anybody speak to that a little bit more? I'm curious to dive into that issue about that funding policy a little bit more.
Well, I mean, the funding policy is sewed into Chapter 36, so if you're going to make changes to it, I'm sure there's going to be, you know, lawsuits against it saying there's contractual rights that you're going against. You know, if you make changes, if the common council were to make changes to it. So that's the big uphill battle. But I'm just saying, if we're looking at the different levers and the different funding policies and all the different things that can and cannot be worked with, you know, there's only so much that can be done actuarially, and it has been in terms of tweaking some of those pieces. And then obviously there's the rate of return, and that's been, you know, tweaked with as well. And as we know from that memo or that email, you know, that Jerry was referring to from Larry, that is a big implication. You go up half a percentage point, huge implication in the millions. So
yeah, I think that's a good, and that's really the point of the stress testing, to see where you can land so you can still have responsible funding of pensions without necessarily, you know, accepting this death wish for city services that the actuaries has laid out for us. So I think it's a good suggestion.
When you said legal, Jerry, what does that mean? Like changing Chapter 36?
Yeah, it might, I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Dropbox with the Taskforce here. I put a slideshow out there, and what I did was cite all the various requirements in the city charter and the state law that require, and Beth's point is right. I mean, it's a lockbox with a chain and a lock around it. It's required by law. It's not even certain that it can be changed unless it's actuary's standards of practice. So Patrick wrote a memo this afternoon, he's on vacation coming back, that I think he's sent it to Aaron, and Aaron's probably going to put it in the Dropbox too, you can read it. But he's saying, look, there's very much uncertainty about whether or not the charter can be changed lawfully and to change the funding policy. I can tell you that it, first of all, it requires to change the charter and funding policy requires the 2/3 supermajority of the city council. It requires approval of the mayor. It requires a 5-vote approval of the pension board. Okay, so it's got to touch all of those branches. And then, of course, as Patrick mentioned, his letter, litigation will likely ensue with a great amount of uncertainty as the outcome of that litigation. So that is a road of tremendous unknowns. It may turn out to be a complete dead end, and if it is, you get down the road 3-4 years of litigation, and you got to pay. And if you can't pay, you're in real trouble, right? So that is one of the limitations or real problems with thinking about changing the funding policy. Chapter 36 is pretty clear about it. When I talked to Pat about the last time, he said there's been an 80-year requirement in the city charter since the 1930s, late 1930s, of having actuarially sound funding. And the chance that the court would allow otherwise is very problematic. So, but Mark, on the other hand, has correctly mentioned that he called it a death wish, and so making the employer insolvent is not a happy potential outcome either. So that thereby lies a dilemma.
When you call it a unit,
We have 100% funding requirement. That's the piece that is an outlier.
In other places, most other places, like Illinois, Kentucky, Rhode Island, all the places that are in trouble, they don't have to do what the actuary says. He files his report and says the actuarially required funding is X, and then the employer does whatever they want to anyway, without any legal consequences. In Illinois, here the legislature for the last 35 years has appropriated pension funds, and every year the legislature would sweep it into the general account and use it for something else. Okay, and they're not required by law to put it in the pension fund. Here, it's hardwired in the city charter. Thou shalt pay whatever the actuary says. And we try to change that. The charter currently says, if you change it, it still has to meet the actuarial standards of practice and be actuarially sound. So changing that is problematic. And certainly would be contested by the members and beneficiaries of the fund.
That's one of the issues where I think that, it's worth studying as a part of that stress test. And we are significantly in some damned if you do, damned if you don't scenarios when it comes to where we're at as a city, when it comes to both that piece potentially, and even when we think about the conversation around studying the PO bonds as well too. So there's not a lot of tremendous options and rosy flowers ahead of us, it seems. But I think at this point it's worth maybe taking a look into diving into many of those pieces just to give us a smorgasbord of options that city leaders can kind of look at as we move forward as well too.
Aaron, why don't you send Patrick a memo about, or at least put it in the Dropbox or something?
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I can put it in the Dropbox. I don't know that I got a memo. I got an email from him earlier today, but yeah.
Are there any other points that have come up in the conversation over the last two meetings or through some of the readings that folks kind of want to bring up to the forefront?
sales tax. How much does that move the needle?
What is it called?
The sales tax, the 0.5%, whether it's, city, county.
Well, I think when it was looked at last year, Dennis, are you still there?
Yeah, I think well, it depends what one you look at. I think we were looking at 1% countywide. would bring in about 164 million, and the question then becomes, what's the breakout to the city? And I think that was being discussed last I was part of those conversations. So I'm not exactly sure what it is, where everything is, but it was a lot of money we were talking about at the time.
Yeah, I definitely feel that sales tax issue, as Mary brought up as well, as one of the first points, that is something that, it's a long shot, obviously, but that's something that we should add to the list of things that we try to bring forward potentially. Obviously, there's been a coalition of folks working on that and talking about that, but it doesn't hurt to raise that as another level from this work of this task force as well, too, in my opinion.
Let me try to point out something though as well. I've been kind of hanging back, I guess, but I think the key to all of this is the benefit structure has to change. Even if you have a sales tax put in, eventually the benefit structure will overcome that sales tax revenue and will eventually face a lot of trouble. So I think from my looks at it, that has to be one of the key factors. Whether you look at it from moving to the state, or if you look at ERS having a similar plan to the states, I think that has to be considered. Otherwise, you're going to face the same escalating costs. The other piece too is when you look at the 7.5 discount rate, or the 7.5 rate of return still used, I know the actuary is going to push for a lower one eventually. Whether they do it now or not, I'm not sure, but that's going to affect us as well. So you're going to have to really look at the benefits, regardless of what you choose, and then you can layer on some of the other solutions.
Dennis, are you speaking about current or prospective or future employees?
I'm talking about both, not necessarily changing the benefit structure for existing, but talking about the contributions, which I can't talk about now.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Aaron, you have your hand up?
I'm glad Mike brought up the sales tax, and I think for the task force's benefit, the mayor talked about a sales tax and the legislature in 2018, specifically around the pension obligations. I think that year we had to make some pretty severe cuts. I think in 2018 it was firehouses that we closed. 2019 again we pushed it. There were, I think, 2 bills introduced in the legislature for sales tax, both for the county and city, and taken up. And then this year, the governor put it in his budget. The legislature took it out. I can tell you that the mayor and the county executive, as well as civic leaders, are continuing to work on that. And one of the things that they're looking to this group for is that recommendation. But I think this group should also know that the sales tax would be in the short term, as Dennis said, a solve for some of these funding issues on the city side. And I think where we're going in terms of what we do for pension funding, huge bond rating agencies to the policy forum, and then over again our revenue. And the sales tax has to be part of any solution that we have. So I'm glad you brought it up, and I think the mayor's always hopeful that it can get picked up. I know that group is talking with legislative leadership. They're able to. We're all crossing our fingers for it.
So it's out of here. Like 10:30 in the morning. I gotta take something.
It's my main life.
Throw it out there again, if there's any other thoughts that the committee has at this point around some of these issues. I think somebody needs to mute if possible.
I mean, do you want to talk a little more about what you're working on with the sales tax? 'Cause I think
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're trying to get both sides of the aisle. And
You gotta hit it.
Yeah, you hit it.
That and then the wall.
Okay.
That's pretty much just about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I think we need somebody to mute who's on the line, please.
I think you need, I'm not so much concerned about me as you, but I mean, if you need an hour or 2 hours.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, you got to mute.
That'd be, if you're willing to work, you know, it'd be better for me if you could.
Aaron and Molly, can you mute everybody?
Yeah, I could, yeah, definitely.
I'm gonna hit that one more time before I start.
It's so integrated and that you need, yeah.
Paul, can you mute everybody on the line?
Okay, well.
I can't mute Mark, unfortunately. I don't have control over his telephone.
Getting there.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but now.
All right. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, once we come out.
Okay, I think there we go.
Okay, well.
So I think the interest is into working with the county and having a sales tax where there's property tax relief. There's a bunch of different things that make it attractive for both sides of the aisle. And you know, having the money that's raised go directly into the pension system. And the other interest is having people, the new hires, go into the state system. And I think we all know the challenges with that. So that's what we're trying to educate everyone on, is the different challenges. And, you know, I think both sides are going to have to figure out how to get it done. And I don't think, it's like going to buy a car. When you go buy a car, the best way to walk away is like nobody's happy. And then you got your car and the salesperson made the sale, and the person has a car. I think that's what's going to have to happen here, is that not everyone's going to be happy. But I think, like what Mary said in the beginning, we're one of the only major metropolitan cities in the country that doesn't have a sales tax. Let's get there. Let's get there. And, but I know it's gonna take a little bit of compromise from both sides. So that's what I know. That's what I'm working on, and with our lobbyists and meeting with people and educating people on the issue that we have at hand and moving forward.
So, Aaron, I think we may be at a point where we have some options that were discussed today, whether good, bad, or in between. That maybe in between this meeting and next meeting, we could potentially write up, and then just come back and have a robust conversation about those options, and presenting those as potentially the slate of how we move forward, whether it's studying new pieces, advocating for other pieces. Or just, looking forward, and maybe break those out to short, near, and long-term potential options for us as a city. I don't know how that feels to the committee.
Yeah.
That sounds good to me. That's Mary.
I'm just wondering, as a baseline, because I don't know if, excuse me, I'm sorry. If in fact folks would want to see as the baseline, and Dennis, I think, could provide, like I say, a macro view of it. Just if we went ahead, the city went ahead and made the contribution and you might want to get input from the city agencies as well, but the city's obviously on the hook the most. Just in round numbers, what would that mean in terms of, position cuts? Just so people know what basically doing, I guess, the baseline alternative means. Because you can pick apart about anything anyone's put out there yet today, but I think the goal is to achieve something that isn't as harrowing as the baseline alternative. So maybe if we could just see that as well when you present thank you.
I think that'd be very helpful, Mark, and I think in terms of, I don't know if it's possible between now and the next meeting to break that out into terms of actual city services as well. As far as, what that would mean for garbage collection moving forward, what that means for DNS inspectors, what that means for a multitude of pieces. As a city resident, that's the stuff that concerns me moving forward. How often is my garbage going to get picked up? How often are the potholes going to get filled? What's the response time for police and fire? Things of that nature. Not necessarily trying to dive too deep into that, but some surface level conversation may be helpful to add context to that number that Mark is thinking about.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. You started.
I've looked at part of it already, and including using the reserves to minimize the impact on employees. And if nothing changed, we'd likely have to cut around 1,300 employees over 5 years.
I also watched the Finance Committee where Aisha presented the information on the pension, and I think Jerry Allen was there as well. And some of this information will be in those slides that she provides us. Because I do recall the 1,300 number. Is that right, Aisha?
I didn't have that number. Mine was just about the pension obligation.
That was my number.
Okay, was that in the same presentation? Because I heard that already.
Yes, it was the same one.
Okay.
Same file, maybe?
Yes.
That's about 25%, I think, right, roughly, of staff.
Yeah, probably close to that, 20 to 25%.
Thank you, Dennis. And keep in mind, I may get boringly into the weeds, but the way the city budget works is we've been able to sort of fence off certain services with user fees, and so cutting those fees don't necessarily translate, cutting those services don't necessarily translate into an ability to put that revenue into the pension fund. So the things that are really exposed, at least from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis, are police, fire, infrastructure, and to a lesser extent, and also to a lesser extent, because they're so small, library and public health. But anyway, because the way the city.
You're correct. The major departments that especially drive the pension costs have very little revenue at all.
Right. So it's sort of a what's the word for that? Not a conundrum, but an irony, I suppose. Thank you.
I was going to ask if intergovernmental consolidation has ever been considered. When you go around the country, there's a lot of places that, right. So you work together with because let's face it, in my talks with all the fire departments around us, their communities are having the same issues we're having, not with the pension contribution, but just finances in general. And, they're looking at cutting fire rates as well. And pretty soon, who's going to respond? So, I just thought of it because you said garbage. Has that ever been looked into, like by the policy forum, of how that all looks and
They
what
do
are,
it
what
for
are, what are the
public safety.
challenges? What's that?
They do it for emergency services all the time, policy form, they
Yeah.
examine how emergency services and fire departments can come in for shared services.
Mhm.
I think that's more relevant with a lot of the smaller Wisconsin towns, they do it a lot,
Right.
but, I mean, I agree with you, I think it would actually save a lot of money, but I don't know legally and politically how that would all work. That's where all the challenges come in.
Right. And in some areas of the health, for example, they are sitting in governmental nature that goes on collaboration. So it works in some areas. Now, overall, like I said, what are the legal implications of that? What are the implications?
Well, I think a lot, there's a political aspect to it too. Like, so you have city leaders that surround us that, let's say, have a more conservative outlook, and so how are you going to get that community to join your community? So like, I know that some talks are talking about like they're taking all the fire department shared services and putting them into one. I just don't think that that whole big bite can happen at once. You look at Madison, and Madison proper, just it happens slowly. And so, you know, I don't, I'm not giving anybody any recommendations. I don't run the government here, but like, you know, maybe that consolidation starts slowly and with one fire department and just see how it works instead of all of them all at one time.
Back about 20 years ago, I went around to Glendale, Greendale, and asked them about that and suggested that we could do it and save them money. They refused to have the city come in. They said it would result in a lot of fire deaths and people dying. Was the communities from their firefighters.
Yeah, the difference is from 20 years ago is that we're already doing it. We already have shared services. So we're already doing it. We have to just get the political champion behind it, because in all the communities surrounding us, your fire chiefs look like me. They're in their early 50s. They grew up in that community. Now they're the fire chief. That's the coolest thing in the world, right? Like, why would you go, hey, that's a great idea. Let's absorb our fire department in Milwaukee. They're not going to do that. I wouldn't do it.
Well, the other thing that I think just consolidating with other communities, they're not going to want to pick up our legacy pension costs.
So I don't know if, you know, having the pension streams mix, like they have their employees, current employees, we have our current employees. They can still keep them in the state pension. It's just where I'm seeing the financial difference is that we don't have enough boots on the ground to do the job. And so if you consolidate a fire department, they don't need as many chiefs. So we can have more Indians doing the work. We can support people out there doing it. Do it like you work for VJS. You can have less supervisors. You can take that money and put it to people swinging hammers.
I know from my perspective, I think that, you know, the city has never really had an issue or concern with looking into some of that consolidation. Even so, Dennis is dating himself, but even in my time at the city after 20 years, less than 20 years ago, there was a committee of the ICC, Intergovernmental Cooperation Council, led by Rob Hinken, that did a bunch of work around consolidating services for local municipalities. Some of it went into good directions. A lot of it didn't go into good directions. So I think that there was a willingness on at least during my time at the city on Mayor Barrett's part to kind of move that conversation forward. We didn't get that reciprocal nature from some of the other communities. And I think even we have Alderman Kovac up there. He can speak to maybe some of the difficulties that he sees on the MICFLIS board every month about folks in their reticence to really want to cooperate with the city when we come out with a a sense of wanting to really see how we can get more value for our services for all of our residents.
McFliss is not bad. We do have our moments though, but it's a good model. You know, it's shared service, although it's kind of a hybrid model since we have independent libraries. Although interestingly, there's a couple of suburbs that might be combining into a library now by Glendale. So I'm on the record being for it. I would be happy to explore city-county consolidation. It's happened in other major metropolitan cities. I think there'd be a lot of revenue benefit to the city. We certainly be, you know, but I think the suburbs would probably say no. But if they said yes, I wouldn't say no. You know, pending the details.
Yeah, what concerns me are that we really have to look at is how much of the pension cost is already built in because of the current active employees and the retirees, and how much would we save moving forward. It sounds like we would still have some pension liability, even if we let a lot of city employees go as we consolidated, because they might be vested and so forth. So we really have to see what the pension savings would be in the end from a consolidation. And I'm not sure if it would add up to much or not, but I think we could look at it.
Well, from a pension perspective, we'd probably have to absorb more than consolidate, which is why they probably want to say no anyway, but that would make them say no even more. Although I don't know what the details of their pension systems are.
Yeah, basically what happened when, because West Milwaukee had happened, where we did consolidate, and basically we took their employees and they became Milwaukee employees, so we really didn't save anything.
And Aaron, maybe that's one of the pieces we throw in the long-term bucket as far as things that need to be studied and looked at on a longer-term basis as far as revenue options, or potentially not revenue options, depending on which direction it comes into. So we're at about, oh, go ahead.
Omar, do you really have to look at consolidation, or do you just look at shared services? Because I know we've done, when I was at NPS, we did some with the city, you know, certain categories of work, and who was able to do it more efficiently and at a cheaper rate. And then instead of, you know, NPS cutting their own grass, the city came a crew or, you know, whatever. And so it's just more service-based, but who can do it more efficiently, fix that up, and it's kind of a trading of who does certain services, or or just looking at the really hard and fast boundaries where you've got a guy here and a guy cutting grass here. Well, if this guy cut it, you know what I mean? Just a little bit of a blurrier line maybe. So I don't know if that's, and then you have some savings, and then you take that savings and you roll it into, you know, where you've got some deficits.
No, absolutely.
That makes sense.
We're at almost 5:40 today, guys. If there's, I guess I would ask if there are any kind of final thoughts or questions as Aaron and Molly kind of have an opportunity to take some of the discussion back and summarize it and get us ready for some prioritization as we move forward. And I guess there is an opportunity as well too, if there's anything that comes up in between now and the next meeting, for us to email them with any thoughts. And like we said, nothing is outlandish at this point when it comes to some of the conversation. So I think as much as we can get out into the open and onto the table is as good as possible.
So if there's nothing else, Mr. Chair, I mean, I volunteer, I'll coordinate with Molly to kind of write up what we have here and maybe outline a draft for the task force to look at next time, and start pulling some of those things together so that we can consolidate these recommendations to the mayor. I'll leave it, I guess, to the task force, but from my perspective, I think the mayor's really open to, you know, all the solutions that this group wants to come up with. I think he wants those ideas, and so, you know, I don't know that there's a need to kind of, you know, pick or choose or leave that out, but I'll leave that to you.
I would agree with that, Aaron. Like you said, I think a smorgasbord is where we're gonna have to head with this versus having one solution rise to the top at this point in time may not be something that we are actually able to do without additional research or additional things coming up. Well, I guess with that being said, if there's no additional comments, maybe I think we can move to adjourn the task force for today.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, everybody, enjoy your Thursday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking about cutting the grass, it's interesting because